Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes. Ongi etorri etortzeagatik y muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta conversación que vamos a tener la suerte de ofrecer hoy aquí entre Macel y Lekha Waitoller. Macel es Curator jefe del Centre Pompidou de París. Lekha es Curator de nuestro museo, como es conocido. Y ambas son las dos curators responsables de la exposición Mujeres de la Abstracción que vamos a inaugurar mañana. La exposición ha sido concebida por Christine en el Centre Pompidou y ha estado en París antes de venir aquí a Bilbao. Esta es una exposición que es muy ambiciosa en su planteamiento y en su desarrollo. Pretende narrar una historia no contada o contada de una manera muy parcial, que es la contribución de las mujeres al desarrollo del movimiento de la abstracción a lo largo de todo el siglo XX. Y es una exposición que para nosotros, como museo, tenía una importancia muy especial y por eso, desde el momento en el que conocimos que estaba gestándose este proyecto en el Centre Pompidou, decidimos sumarnos a él. Como muchos recordarán, hace 5 años el museo presentó una exposición dedicada al expresionismo abstracto, una extraordinaria exposición que comisarió Lucía Aguirre, que era una exposición donde se reflejaba de una manera muy exhaustiva y muy fiel ese movimiento tan fundamental para la historia del arte del siglo XX y específicamente para nuestra propia colección. Aquella exposición, porque realmente ese movimiento fue así, tenía una presencia femenina muy pequeña. De hecho, yo creo que solamente figuraba en aquella exposición obras de un artista, Krasner, a la que después tuvimos la ocasión de dedicarle una exposición también en el museo. Pero evidentemente se puso de manifiesto aquella ausencia de la figura de las mujeres artistas en un momento tan importante de la historia del arte. De ahí nuestra preocupación por intentar reflejar en la programación del museo de una manera creciente la presencia y la actividad de las mujeres artistas. Por eso desde entonces hemos tenido en el museo exposiciones dedicadas a algunos artistas fundamentales del siglo XX, como Annie Albers, como Lilla Clark, como la propia Krasner, ahora Alice Neal, que tenemos en el museo desde hace unas semanas. Pero evidentemente cuando supimos de que esta exposición se estaba gestando, pensamos que el museo era un lugar adecuado, idóneo para poderla acoger. Es una exposición de la que nos van a hablar Christine y Lekha. Es una exposición, como decía, muy ambiciosa, con un planteamiento muy abierto, que cronológicamente recoge de finales del siglo XIX, pero fundamentalmente a lo largo del siglo XX hasta la década de los 80, con una perspectiva muy multidisciplinar, donde hay pintura y escultura, pero también se refleja la danza, se refleja la fotografía, se refleja el cine, se refleja las artes decorativas y específicamente el ámbito de la producción textil, precisamente para reflejar la importancia de muchas artistas mujeres que trabajaron en esos campos. Y además con una perspectiva muy global. No hay artistas solamente de Europa o de América del Norte, hay artistas también procedentes de Latinoamérica, de Asia. Hay artistas, muchas de ellas muy poco conocidas, algo más de 100 artistas los que están presentes en esta exposición. Por eso es una exposición que yo creo que es un hito en la programación de este museo. Creo que es una exposición que merece la pena visitar en sucesivas ocasiones porque hay más de 400 obras, pero qué mejor introducción que la charla que nos van a ofrecer aquí, la conversación entre Lekha y Christine. Muchas gracias y gracias a vosotras dos.
Gracias, Juan. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al museo.
Christine y yo, nuestro idioma que compartimos es el inglés, con lo cual vamos a mantener esta conversación en inglés y espero poder aclarar esta exposición tan ambiciosa como acaba de indicar Juan Ignacio y que evidentemente, todos conocéis cómo es la segunda planta del museo, lo amplio que es este espacio. Y digamos que lo hemos llenado con muchísimas gemas, muchísimas joyas que son muy interesantes, puesto que la exposición, como es tan grande, decidimos abordar algunos de los temas más importantes de la exposición hoy y vamos a hablar de algunas de las figuras más sobresalientes y pensamos que esto os dará algo de información para que cuando vayáis a la exposición, cuando lo visitéis por vuestra propia cuenta, podréis recopilar algunos de esos temas que están en el mismísimo corazón de la exposición. Bien, lo que vamos a hacer, vamos a empezar con algo que os impresionará cuando lleguéis a la segunda planta. Está justo fuera de una de las últimas galerías, pero es lo que veis cuando llegáis en el ascensor de vidrio.
Of the 110 artists that are in this exhibition. So we thought we'd start by talking about why this is important. What does this lend to the discourse in the exhibition?
Yeah, for me it was a statement to make these women visible, because one of the issues of this exhibition is invisibilization. I mean, this process of not making these artists visible in art history. Also, everything exists, the work out there. The big question is why they were not included in histories of abstraction. There are many answers. The first one is the answer from Linda Nochlin in 1971, who said that the art history was written by male critics, which is one very important reason. But there is a history of abstraction written by a female art historian at the end of the 60s, Dora Valier, and she writes about Kandinsky, about Kupka, about Mondrian, and there is no chapter devoted to a woman. So it's not only the reason, as you can see, it's really that there was a sort of canon that was established in the 1930s, both in America and Europe, through the MoMA collection and then the Guggenheim also. This has stayed the canon for a very long time. My aim was to put a new light and to not to write another canon, but to interrogate this sort of discourse that was dominant and too overwhelming for so many women. Some you know, I mean the names are well known, like Sonia Delaunay or Sophie Teubera, but you might not know their faces. And so the aim of this installation was to make you think about the fact that you don't know their faces, because they are not reproduced in magazines or art books. And this shows how much more you know Giacometti's, Picasso's, or I don't know, Pollock's face rather than Krasner or François Gillot. You know, that was the point. And so it's to be experienced, to be looked at. And the last point is about the representation of female artists by themselves or by photographers. And you will see that they are not so much in action at the beginning. So the idea is to show that they make abstraction and that they are active in the studio, which is more visible in the second part of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually one of the really interesting details that you can see as you get close to this wall. You can kind of make this out on the screen too. But there is a really interesting and noticeable shift in the early portraits of the artists, which are very much studio portraits. They're very formal. And then at a certain moment in time, we start to see them in a more active state in the studio, practicing their art and being photographed as artists. So it's an interesting shift that one can observe in the layout of this portrait wall. The other thing I was going to mention, which kind of leads us into the next part of this introduction, is that the order of these women is not necessarily chronological. It's sort of loosely chronological, but it follows the organization of the exhibition, which is, again, loosely chronological, but also organized in themes, and also includes some different monographic moments where we've had opportunities perhaps thanks to the deep holdings of the Centre Pompidou's collection, for example, to really show one artist's work in more depth, or where we've been able to pair artists who knew each other and maybe worked in the same environment together. And so it created this sort of natural coming together. So maybe with that, we could also...
Seems true. So you see, this was the image I chose for the Pompidou venue. So you see Linda Benglis in action. So that's the statement. In French, it's they make abstraction. It doesn't sound great in Spanish, I guess. So that's why you choose...
Mujeres de la abstracción.
Right.
Yeah,
but the idea is with this image to show that they were co-creators of the story of modernism and after. So that's the first important statement. And therefore, they have to be included in a new history of abstraction. Then my conception of abstraction is a very open one. So I would call it expanded abstraction. I'm considering every medium and not only painting as a way to express a new language that is called abstraction. Because very often you would think of abstraction, okay, abstract painting, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich. But in fact, abstraction is a word that describes, at least in aesthetic, a kind of a new language that was basically existing from the most ancient times, but that was reformulated at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And the fact is that if you begin to think about it and try to define it, it will be very difficult. So I will help you there to make it shorter. So generally, people would say it's not figurative or it's not referring to the real. But when you think of it, I mean, a cycle is a figure. So if you have a painting with a cycle, you cannot say it's not figurative or that is abstraction. You can only say it's not referring to something that belongs to the real, so you can say it's non-objective. Meaning it's not referring to an object. But then you have abstraction that refers to the real. For example, the city of Marie Vieira da Silva that are reduced into simple forms. So this sort of abstraction can still represent something. So I'm just trying to tell you how much it's complicated and how much abstraction has been reduced to something that looks more like a Kandinsky or a Malevich, which is normally defined as non-objective painting. But in fact, it's a plastic language that has many definitions according to place, time, and cultures. And that's why I open also the choices beyond the Occidental canon, trying to open 2 different continents. Of course, Latin America, because they were modern with another story at the same time of the European artists. But also Asia, in which you find totally different models. For example, the sort of a new abstraction of Irene Chou, which is at the end of the artist, which is not abstraction as we understand it in Europe, because for them abstraction means a painting, an art that is deprived of figures. They cannot express it in another way because for them it doesn't exist as a concept. And in fact, their abstraction is something different from what we speak about. They know, of course, European modernism, but they don't think about it the same way. I think we will not be able in this little conversation to go through all the works, but for me it's important that when you look at a painting and maybe read the captions, you always have in mind this complexity of the notion of abstraction. And I think it's particularly exciting because the more you look at abstraction, the more you can perceive the nature and the essence of the abstraction we are looking at. So this will be clear maybe if we begin to speak about spiriticism.
Yeah. I also wanted to make clear that that last artist that you were talking about, Irene Chu, is a Chinese artist.
Yeah,
So,
at the end of the show. Yeah.
Thinking about sort of these different centers, and maybe abstraction is sort of an onion that can be unpeeled because there are so many layers depending on time and place. So the exhibition begins again sort of with with the earliest artwork in the exhibition. So in this way, yes, chronological. Georgiana Hutton is an artist that was born in the Canary Islands, but lived mainly in London. And she, this section, I think, is one of the ways that this exhibition is very distinguished from other exhibitions that have explored this idea of abstraction. I think we would agree on that.
Yeah, because I wanted to include it, the premises, an abstraction that is not the non-objective abstraction, but that looks abstract, but it's representational. Because the idea here with spiriticism is that you communicate with spirit, so you represent something and you use symbols, or at least these lines here that refer to the message of God. So you cannot say that it's not referring to anything. It represents the transcendental dimension of the spirit, but it doesn't have any object that you can recognize. I hope it's clear. So the process here of spirit drawing, it was mostly figurative at the time, and so that's why it's quite exceptional. We're in the 1860s, and I don't want to remake the chronology of abstraction and say, okay, she made abstraction before Kandinsky, which is something I heard about Hilma af Klint, which is not true, because we don't speak about the same kind of abstraction. So don't misunderstand my intention. I am trying to just say that there was a kind of abstraction before the non-objective abstraction of the 1910s that was overlooked.
Yes,
right. And that was also linked to spiriticism and theosophy, which is a way of putting all the religions sort of together by the famous Blavatsky, the 19th century. And this way of dealing with the world was very open to women and very symbolistic. So in fact, Hilma af Klint also is referring to theosophical symbols with the swans that she's reducing into forms. So she's representing something. It's not a form that is totally not referring to the real. It looks like maybe Rodchenko, whatever, but in fact it's a reduction of two pictures of a swan, so a male and a female, with the color that is used symbolically, the pink, the red, the male, the female, and at the end it looks like a sort of elementary radical abstraction, but her aim was not abstraction. Her aim was to symbolize two theosophical principles.
One of the things that I think is really interesting too about this theme of the spiritual and spiritism is that this way, and this carries through the exhibition as well, is that very often, of course, female artists had different access than did their male counterparts to education, to showing their work, and this sort of mode of thinking about the transcendental and also communicating something spiritual through their art was a very libertarian perspective, and it allowed the entrance of women. So it's one of the reasons that we see more female artists than males practicing this kind of art, and it has everything to do with opportunity, really. We see this later, and this is one of the reasons that the scope of the exhibition is very important here. It sort of reinforces this openness to thinking about abstraction in a much broader way. Another sub-theme in the exhibition, the second one actually, is about the idea of dance and the way that different artists and dancers were thinking about using their bodies in a way that could create these geometric forms and also abstractions through the body. Oh, and this started right up, so.
So the point I wanted to make, because I did a show called Dance Your Life with this work present, and that's where I got this idea that in fact you have also a performative abstraction, because the aim of Loie Fuller, who is not in this film because it's an imitation of her, she didn't want to be ever filmed, is to create a form in color and movement. So here is the film is colored, because at the time colored cinema did not exist, so you don't have the initial impression, which was that she was moving with this silk fabric on herself, doing these movements, and she had like 40 projectors with different colors on her, so acted by technicians. So it was also a total Gesamtkunstwerk, a total artwork already, and really the body was disappearing, and it was an abstract spectacle. So, and you can see it's the whole story of dance and abstraction, using the geometry of the body also to create lines. This was what Gret Paluca was doing. And Kandinsky did this drawing on the right side of her because he was fascinated by her dance, this geometry of the body. And she was also teaching dance with a Mondrian painting in her studio to link the body to geometry. And okay, this is a long story, but this was just the one of the statement of the show. And one of the last statement, it's not the last, but the most important, is that with some artists, there was no clear difference in their practice and also in their understanding of abstraction between painting and all other possible solutions. So it can be called decorative arts or textile works. And in fact, a lot of these artists, like Delaunay also with poetry, when she illustrated Blaise Cendrars, they were educated first with decorative arts. So, for example, Sophie Teuber-Arp, she invented her abstraction with textile. And so I'm trying to break also the barriers between the practices that one artist chose to express oneself, and to even include the publicities, advertising, everything that was using an abstract language in their work. And also reconsidering the Russian avant-garde, including not only the painting of Popova or Stepanova, but also their contribution to the pattern fabric that they created in the 1920s, the dresses and so on. So the extension of this vocabulary or language to the everyday life in a mass production perspective. That was the ideology of the production of the 20s in the Russian state.
This section also has some, I'm not sure that we have any examples of it here, but in the galleries, you'll see that it also has a wonderful, these artists had wonderful engagement with the theater. And so there's an amazing maquette for a theater that's in the galleries, and also a film where we see that one of the artists had made costumes for the production. So it's again, a very broad reach that so many of these artists had, which to me also feels quite contemporary, because so many of the artists living today work in so many different media. And
yeah, it's more than the modern, we're more contemporary than we thought.
Yes.
And each time you research about dance, about whatever, you always find that they had less barriers that were constructed, I think, mostly post-war, with this kind of idea of high art, conceptualism, which I'm not against, of course, but that was putting aside. A lot of artists were using other material, like you will see with fiber art, or that was kind of forbidden to use fabric or ceramic, or, and now it's much more relaxed, but because there were these fights and rewriting of art history.
Yeah.
In the recent years, actually, I tried to contribute on that, and that's really changing the practice also of young artists in art school, that they are allowed to go back to techniques. And not only being conceptual. And this kind of 60s, post-60s situation was really putting a lot of artists in the shadow. You will see Jaco Dabwich, who is doing fiber pieces. She was super famous in the 70s and disappeared afterwards because no one should ever speak about fiber art.
Right. Yeah, there are these
It's
sort
too
of
female.
unpopular pitfalls. Another thing that especially this section makes me think about, but also the one of with Sonia Delaunay-Turc, who was, by the way, exiled during World War I in Spain, and opened a shop in Madrid called Casa Sonia, where I would have loved to have gone to shop and buy some of her clothes. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the examples of them physically here, but we do have a slideshow of that in the gallery. But I've really thought a lot with this exhibition, because of the birth years of most of these artists. The grand majority have lived through wars, sometimes multiple wars, coups d'etats, Great Depression, very difficult economic and beyond that circumstances. Many ended up having to be exiled or move for different difficult reasons, maybe ones that they would not have chosen to. And I think that really compels a certain level of creativity that is also sometimes linked to practicality, right?
Yeah, because they had to deal with everyday life. So, for example, you quote Sonia Delaunay. When she did this Casa Sonia, it's because she needed money.
Yeah.
So she was ruined after she had to move after the revolution in Russia, and that's why she decided to do these clothes.
Exactly. People don't have to be able to buy a painting to survive, but we all do need something to put on. So you get these sort of practical dips in some of these careers that, of course, we see here too with the Russian artists who were also innovating better fabrics that could be worn by workers. They were involved in that. And then we see that later too in the Bauhaus.
Yeah, the Bauhaus is a very special moment because it's a school that was supposed to be open to women, at least on paper, or that's what Gropius said. But at the end, his sponsors found so problematic this presence of women that he decided to have a women class, which turned to be the textile class, run by Annie Albers, the wife of Joseph Albers, who was forced actually to practice tapestry, and then became the artist of this kind of art using textile, and open a door that is still open now.
Yeah, and I think that this is such an interesting backstory to the Bauhaus, which of course is a fairly well-known school that had this wonderful egalitarian focus of bringing together arts and crafts and sort of doing away with these hierarchies, but then yes.
But in fact, it was not so true. But the fact is that with the tapestry, they had so much success that these carpets that Gropius even put into his office, the fact that they could sell this carpet helped to finance the school.
Exactly.
That was the paradoxical thing. Thanks to this woman, the school could survive in Dessau.
They had financial solvency, which was, yes, another practical thing that we all need. We're jumping now in time. There is more work that comes out of the Bauhaus and the exhibition on photography with some interesting things related to wallpaper. But we're moving forward in time and changing location to New York, to the New York School with abstract expressionism. We see here it's sort of coming back to this idea of the mural with all of the portraits. You know, there are a lot of figures here that are really easy to recognize. Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, a lot of really
Still, and one woman.
And only one woman here.
Hedda Stern.
Hedda Stern, who regretted later that she was more recognized for being part of this portrait than she was for her artwork. I think that this picture is interesting, though, because the grand majority of these male artists were also married to female artists. And they were all working side by side in New York during these years. It was a very difficult economic time coming out of the war. There were a lot of new immigrants in the United States, particularly in New York City at this time. And they were all finding their way, fighting for opportunity. In the exhibition, we have sort of the early generation of these Abex painters, and then a sort of later generation that follows them. So there's sort of a natural break in the presentation. Amongst the early ones is Janet Sobel.
Yeah, so I wanted to really put a light on her work. Maybe I put too much light because now the work is extremely expensive. So it has taken 1-0 in 1 year. So she was already in the collection of the MoMA, where this painting comes from. And Peggy Guggenheim, who was the first, no, not the first actually, the first was Catherine Dreyer in the 1920s, but Peggy Guggenheim opened a gallery in the 40s, the art of this century, where she showed Sobel, and she said it's one of the major painters of her time and so on. And then she was bought by MoMA later on, 2 beautiful paintings. Also this one on the right belongs to a private collector, but she kind of disappeared and was considered, because also of the statement of Greenberg, as a primitive painter. So Clement Greenberg, the famous critic, who was as powerful, I would say, as Alfred Barr, the director of the MoMA at the time. And these 2 personalities were really shaping the history of art and abstraction from the 30s to the 60s in New York. And Janet Sobel, also Greenberg wrote that she was viewed by Pollock, who admired the painting and came back to Drip after seeing hers. He said that she was just a housewife and then a self-taught artist, so not so important. So you see how just one sentence can kill an artist, and then you need 60 years to
60
rediscover.
Years, yeah, to resuscitate the figure.
Yeah.
There's a small homage paid to 3 very important and powerful visionaries in the exhibition, 2 of whom you've named, Peggy Guggenheim and Catherine Dreyer, and then Hilary Bay is the third. These are names that are familiar to this group. Of course, the legacy with the Guggenheim Museums is very tightly related to them. And interestingly, while none of them would have been described as feminists, and this is sort of another issue at play, yes, not at all. When the count was made of the women that Peggy Guggenheim showed when she had Art of this Century, she actually showed a really high percentage of women, and she did some very innovative things that today would not seem innovative. One was that she curated an exhibition with some help called 31 Women, and that's sort of a landmark exhibition that is recognized in a slideshow in this exhibition. All 3 of these figures had very important marks on all of the lives in this Abex section of the exhibition.
But, precisely, Lee Krasner, that's a good transition. She didn't want to be in Peggy Guggenheim's show because she said, I don't want to be recognized as a woman artist. And that's a position of most of the artists in general that they say, and I would say the same as a curator. I'm not a female curator. I'm a curator. So of course that's pretty natural, but so it's exactly the contrary of what I'm doing here in this show. And I'm totally conscious about it, but I think to move forward, we need that as a point of departure to rewrite our art history. And then the best would be, of course, to make monographs. But if you are not even aware of Janet Sobel or Georgina Houghton, you will never do these monographs. So we need different steps. And of course, this is just part of history, but it's adding narrative. And nowadays, we know that there is not one narrative, but many polyphonic stories that forms linear, horizontal history, not so hierarchical, and that you have intertwine all these narratives to get a bigger one. There is no possibility to have a unified, and it's like in quantum physics, you cannot have a unified and clear and definite vision, and that's maybe better like this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this definitely lays that out, the complexity of that. And as probably everybody here is aware of, we have just had a monographic moment with Lee Krasner. We had an exhibition of hers on our first floor gallery, which was a great opportunity to see these different moments in her career, the way that she developed this abstract vocabulary over time. And in this exhibition, we've got 3 of these early works, which are really knockouts. Here we've got an image of Helen Frankenthaler, who comes a little bit later than some of these earlier figures.
She was the girlfriend of the Clement Greenberg I was quoting, but
That's
didn't help so much.
It didn't help her case too much.
She was famous because she was using this this technique of pouring the painting, so
on an unprimed
it's absorbed
canvas.
directly by the canvas,
Yeah.
with no drawing, of course. And this was very a source of big inspiration for Clifford Steele, for Barnett Newman, and she was recognized as a precursor of color field painting.
Okay, and this section also in the exhibition sort of gives way to a more international look at what could maybe be called abstract expressionism, but also sort of different ways, different approaches from different parts of the globe.
There was a very big tradition called danchekwa, the Korean abstraction, the post-war, but with very few women known actually. And Woo Kyung-choi moved to New York to invent her own style, which is very striking. It's a sort of mix of the heritage of danchekwa, of pop and expressionism. Which is really very strong, and then she came back to Korea and lived very alone and not recognized among these male artists. She was very feminist at the time, but very alone
Living on her
in
own.
her discourse in Korea, which is, as you know, a very patriarchal culture still nowadays.
She also died very young, so there's not so much of her work.
She was very prolific in a short time, but it's true, she could have had an exceptional
a very long career,
recognition if she would have lived longer.
Yeah. Okay, and then we have another big jump here.
No, the jump is in fact not so big, because the idea is to see how abstraction becomes reinvented internationally, and also that artists come from Lebanon, like Shuker or Turkey for that, to study in Paris. And at the same time, they do works that are sort of modular abstraction with different background. I mean, philosophically, she's inspired by Arab poetry. And so the way the letters fit together. And Sufi philosophy, about non-duality. Whilst Dead is totally more formalist, but a kind of obsessive painting that is filling the whole canvas. And so at the end of the 40s, there is this new big trend of abstraction that goes beyond Europe, and that is called in Paris Salon des Réalités Nouvelles. So you have Carmen Herrera, who comes from Cuba. It's really becoming a huge language for a lot of artists. Also in Latin America, with very interesting specificities. And then we enter this new aesthetic in the 60s that you were showing afterwards about using new materials. So not only stone or paint, and I forgot to speak about photography and cinema because we don't have time, but then there was this idea of soft sculpture that was coming in the air, and a lot of artists were trying to bring together the practice of tapestry that is linked to traditional activities and sometimes women activities to sculpture. And this has created a new movement that was called fiber art or wall hangings. That was the title of the show that was realized in MoMA in 1969, this picture. So where you see Sheila Hicks on the left and Jacoda Buich on the right and Leonor Tonnet. So they are all in the show right now. It's not a reconstruction of the MoMA show, but it's to also understand the idea that soft material and like fiber or latex, for example, that was also the material used by Eva Hesse, were leading sculpture or wall pieces in a different direction.
This is an interesting moment, especially for Eastern European and American artists, I think, who were also, here we've got another one.
And Spanish also.
And the Spanish, as we have in the work of Aurelia Munoz, which is an artist from Catalunya, who has certainly not had her moment in the light yet. This picture, I apologize for it. It's not a professional picture. It's of our installation, so there's not a clean background, but we wanted to give you an idea of what it is. There was an important biennale that was established in Lausanne, Switzerland, in the, I think 70s, it was
early 70s or 60s.
It was the mid-60s. I want to say 64. And a lot of these artists, Aurelia was one of them, also Jacoda, and several others.
Hicks,
Sheila Hicks also were able to have this sort of forum to come together and speak about this art form that had traditionally been thought of as very domestic, very relegated to sort of the decorative sphere, and how they could liberate that really.
But the problem is that
that
until recently, even Sheila Hicks 10 years ago was not even considered, even I would say, the Pompidou as an artist. They would consider her as somebody producing decorative art, because she was also doing things for Air France, flights, or so something more linked to design. She was in between, but in fact raised as a painter and studying with Joseph Albers, so totally aware of what she was doing. And she chose fiber because she went to Mexico and she was interested in Chile traditions also, and so on. So you have to think that this show was not sufficient to change the art history. It's really a new way of thinking art history in the last 10 years that could slowly change the perspective. Also, when I showed the piece at the Biennale, it was a huge success for Sheila, and she said there was a before and a after for me. So it's really like also the new generation of young artists is more free with medium, as I was saying. And so the way of looking at this 60s and 70s pieces is different. But this is obviously not decorative, but it's a sculpture.
Yeah, this very much takes over a space and becomes an installation, a sculptural installation, rather than something that can be put aside on a wall or over a couch.
So the abstract tradition of sculpture begins in the show. You will see with Stoiber, with then Barbara Hepworth, who is a major figure. And slightly you see that form is dislocated, and that the geometrical feeling or design of the 30s is dissolving in a sort of anti-form, and that's specific of the end of the 60s with artists such as Eva Hesse, Louise Bourgeois, that Lucy Lippard, the art critic, included in her show Eccentric Abstraction. That's perfect, we are on the picture. So that's why, in fact, the real show was to, you see the Alice Adams piece, the metallic one, and on the floor, I think it's of her. I mean, we don't see on the picture the Eva Hesse and Louise Bourgeois, because Louise Bourgeois is in latex, so it's a small sculpture we cannot loan for a show. I chose another piece that speaks about softness and being...
I don't think we have it in this presentation.
Rosemary Castor, it looks abstract, but it's also very representational, because it's about armpit hairs. And it's referring to the female body in a very funny manner. So it's how you can reinvent sculpture and an abstract language and still refer to the body. It's a very big question also in the 70s.
This section, Eccentric Abstraction, also does, I would say, have a through line of humor. It's subtle, but these sort of references like bulbous curves, and this one about armpit hair, which is not made with armpit hair, and these sort of different
plaster and graphite.
Yes, made with a broom,
yes,
actually.
With a broom.
So an interesting, again, sort of domestic tool. But there is sort of a subtle humor that underlies the works in this section, which I think is interesting. Oh, and we do have, okay, I thought it wasn't here, but here's the sculpture that you were thinking about. And so the section, so then these ideas give way in the exhibition to a sort of very different direction, one that's very honed in, very precise in its nature. That's these different artists that are thinking about the line and the different ways that they can work with very...
It's a show in itself, the line and the subject. And there was a very beautiful show about the line at MoMA. The line that is dancing, or dance and line, and Agnes Martin was part of the show, but I wanted to make like two sections with a sort of straight lines and soft lines. So there is a kind of sensitivity which is more Agnes Martin, like kind of straight, minimal.
Very related to the grid also.
Yeah, but as you know, Agnes Martin is not so minimal that it seems. It's very subtle and sometimes more metaphysical than spiritual. There is something very deep. It's not only about geometry. Also, Lucinda Child is a bit more radical. She's doing lines with her own body, and she's referring to Sol Lewitt with the grid. And also in this piece called Katema, where she's designing lines in the space. And then there is another tendency with artists like the Indian Arpita Singh, or the Gego from Venezuela, or Bice Lazzari from Italia, which is more about like loose lines, you know. And then we come to Esther Ferrer, who's a very important artist, also Spanish,
One that you probably all know from her retrospective that was here at the Guggenheim Bilbao a few years ago. This particular drawing, which is a little bit hard to read on screen, it doesn't reproduce so easily, is from her long series, Poema de los Números Primos, which is a series that she started in the 70s and has continued through today. And it's one where she really reduces the work to mathematics, removing all chance and drawing these very precise lines, first in graphite and then highlights them in thread. So, I mean, most of the works in this section are ones that require very slow looking, getting up very close to see the details. They're very beautiful and subtle works.
This is our guest of honor who came today to install her work, Harmony. She precisely did something quite astonishing. She's an activist, feminist, who was opening one of the first women art space in New York, the AIR, and then co-founded the Heresies magazine in the 70s. She claimed and wrote a famous text about the fact that abstraction could be political. And so she's using a tradition of Native Americans with this species. So being on the floor at the center of it to make it. So being saying something like, I am centered and powerful as a woman. And so she said we should really take back this tradition of textile without shame and be proud of it. And that's a political act.
Yeah, definitely. And one that, again, is a through line in this exhibition. I was thinking about it as you were talking about the fiber artists, including Aurelia and the others that we spoke about. There are so many cases of artists that really go back and think about the traditional techniques of their countries. We also have Munir Farmanian,
yes, right.
Who's another interesting example of someone who, in her country of Iran, looks back at this.
Yeah, the Mukaras in Iran. Yeah.
The beautiful works made with mirrors. And Harmony, of course, is also picking that up. She lives in New Mexico, was surrounded by people that knew of this technique. And while these aren't sort of mainstream practices, and I feel that makes them even more bold or radical, to choose this route rather than, say, painting, which is has a more sort of direct line to being sold in a gallery, for example. These are such interesting works. Because it's hard to read these on screen, I just wanted to also point out that these works sit directly on the floor, so they're not hung on the wall. They sit just directly on the floor, not on a pedestal. Harmony Hammond.
She's a friend of Harmony, by the way, and
Howardina
they
Pendel.
used to co-write and co-found Heresies. She was
Also a co-founder
assistant curator at MoMA.
Yes, that's right.
So she's very informed. And as a woman of color, she also had a political understanding of abstraction. And the little dots that you see in the painting are inspired by the pink dots that in her hometown they were putting below the glasses to separate the black people from the white ones.
The glasses that black people could drink from, as opposed to white people. This was in the South in the United States.
So it looks like Monet, but it's very political.
This was also an interesting moment in her career before a life-changing car accident, a very grave car accident that she was in, where we're still seeing purely abstract work. After that moment, she really took a turn, and so her more recent work, she's elderly now, but still practicing as an artist, and is receiving very late but good attention, critical attention on her work, and much of the newer work can be read as much more political than what one can see in this example. But as you said, she's also had this very long, active participation in a lot of political activity in terms of both writing, but also staging political publications and
Yeah,
really
and,
thought-provoking work.
Afro-American,
Yeah.
one of the first texts I found on the subject in Heresis. And what I wanted to say also, that I wanted to make visible that there was no feminist doxa in the 70s. There were artists who thought that abstraction could be political, and artists who thought that abstraction was the worst thing for a woman artist because she should use figurative images to be against the male, white male abstraction that was linked to a patriarchal modernity. So that's, you can find in the vitrines or sentences we put together, because it's very important to understand that it was not homogeneous and there was a lot of debate. These debates are not finished yet. There is still a discourse about that nowadays in the States. And I mean, it's like every generation is remaking the same confrontation between abstraction and figuration. But as you can see, it's not the point. The point is that with whatever language an artist can express what he wants, and we should go beyond actually this kind of confrontation.
This more simplified debate, yeah.
Abstraction was also considered in New York to be too much conservative and linked to the market, because it was what was selling the most to put above your
easy to sell,
easy
to sell,
yeah,
easy to
easy to sell. Yeah. So you see,
it's complex.
It's a complex story.
Well, we've finished our presentation. I know that there's not a lot of time left, but we could take a couple of questions, I think, if there are any questions from the audience.
We have exhausted the public with too
Yes.
much talk.
Well, there's a lot to mull through with this exhibition, that's for sure. And for those of you that live in Bilbao or nearby, I recommend multiple visits. It's a lot to absorb and take in, and being able to do it little by little is kind of a pleasure. Of course, tomorrow we have a soft opening, and on Friday we open to the public. This weekend we have the museum is open for free for the 24th anniversary of the museum here in Bilbao. So I expect that we'll also have a lot of people this weekend. Well, thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the galleries.
Thank you very much. Problem is we have put the mask again.